The first speaker of the symposium is Ulrike Steinert, a postdoctoral researcher in the research training group Early Concepts of Humans and Nature at Johannes Gutenberg University, Mainz, Germany. Her research and publications focus on the history of Mesopotamian medicine and culture, the Akkadian language, women's health, gender and body concepts, as well as a metaphor research. Her talk will provide an introduction to ancient Mesopotamian notions of the self, which include several facets and embodied identity, such as self-consciousness, agency, and will. So we are also collaborators with Ulrike, working together with Sanna Svärd on the embodiment of emotions as they are treated in Akkadian texts. Ulrike, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Mikko, and hello to everyone here. I will share my screen now and hope you can see it.
We do.
Go to full screen mode. Okay then. You can hear me loud and clearly?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Wonderful. Then we can go into action. So my talk today draws on sources from ancient Mesopotamia, one of the cradles of civilization in the ancient Near East, where for the first time in history, we find complex, stratified societies with such traits as urbanism, state organization, rulership, large-scale polities, and the use of writing, in particular cuneiform writing. On the other hand, my discussion today is strongly inspired by anthropological work on cross-cultural variation in concepts of the self, especially work by the French anthropologist Philippe Descola, and especially his book Beyond Nature and Culture, on which I will draw and which I have found very useful in my recent work. In this book, Descola presents a systematic inventory of basic types of cultural ontologies defined by differing views of the self in relation to views of others and the world. These ontologies are based on what Descola calls modes of identification and modes of relation. Modes of identification and relation are examples of what Descola calls integrating schemas. These are highly abstract cognitive structures which are of a collective nature and acquired in socialization. They organize structures of thoughts, feelings, and individuals' relations to others and the world. These schemas are durable dispositions that are reinforced by one's experiences in a given social environment. They guide perception and provide frameworks for interpreting behavior patterns and events. In fact, Descola calls these schemas elementary schemas of practice because they come to organize social system and cultural beliefs. These schemas are discernible in customs, but they are also serve as frameworks for vernacular or scholarly models reflected, for example, in myths, ritual formulae, in body techniques, taboos, and so on. The modes of identification consist in fundamental ways to structure resemblances and differences between self and other beings, based on specific properties ascribed to them. According to Descola, there's only a limited number of such integrating schemas, and they depend on the type of social organization and cultural system they are part of. In fact, the four basic modes of identification Descola traces are frequently repeated in history, and the cosmologies of different cultures, times, and places can potentially be assigned to one of these ontologies. Fundamental to modes of identification is the awareness of a self that discriminates itself from other beings. Already Marcel Mauss in 1950 proposed that the sense of self, the sense of one's individuality, possessed by human beings can be regarded as universal, whereas notions of what constitutes a person can differ widely across cultures. Descola proposes, however, that there are two cross-culturally common attributes of the self that can be ascribed also to other beings, namely physicality and interiority. This means that human beings everywhere perceive themselves as a mixture of these two types of attributes, which they can recognize in or deny to other beings. Physicality refers to corporeal properties and the physical constitution of the being, such as external form, substance, physiological processes, but also behavior patterns and modes of life. Interiority, on the other hand, refers to properties partially covered by the English terms mind, consciousness, or soul, including aspects such as intentionality, subjectivity, reflexivity, the ability to have thoughts, feelings, and to reflect about oneself, to express oneself, and also to dream. The juxtaposition of physicality and interiority as universal attributes of the self does not mean, however, that people everywhere conceive of the human being in terms of a strict duality of body and mind, or that they emphasize everywhere the individual as an autonomous, independent entity. Not in all cultures does the body constitute an absolute boundary of the self. The human being may consist of many constitutive units, some of which may manifest in other human or non-human entities and elements in the person's environment. Components linked to interiority may be intimately connected with the body. In this vein, for example, the anthropologist Marilyn Strathern proposes that in Melanesian societies, for example, the person is rather regarded as a individual, not an individual, meaning that a human being is defined by his or her social position and relations within a social network, and that the elements of a person depend on entities external to oneself and on one's social relations with others. As Descola proposes in his study, there are four basic modes of identification or ontologies on the level of distributing the attributes physicality and interiority to human and non-human entities, producing sets of similarity and difference. The possibilities of distributing similarities and difference are as follows. I can assume that a being has a similar physicality and interiority as myself, or that these properties are distinct from mine, or that we share either similar physicalities or similar interiorities. And one of these principles is realized in the four ontologies that Descola suggests, and which he calls animism, totemism, naturalism, and analogism. So due to constraints of time, I won't be able to go into all of these ontologies. But what I would like to do is illustrate one ontology, namely analogism, by example of ancient Mesopotamian views of self. So analogism is an ontology that divides up the collection of existing beings into a multiplicity of forms, separated by small distinctions and sometimes arranged on a graduated scale. This type of ontology is very common cross-culturally and found in varying forms in the world's pre-modern civilizations, from China to Mesopotamia to Mesoamerica, and also Europe, from classical Greece to the Renaissance. But it is also found, for example, in various African societies. This system posits gradual discontinuities in the components of existing beings, emphasizing on the one hand the differences both in physicality and interiority. On the other hand, this ontology is obsessed, one could say, with detecting similarities between beings and things. Analogical ontologies lay emphasis on relationships and correspondences between the human sphere and the cosmos, on correlations between microcosm and macrocosm, reflected, for example, in medical theories, seeing the body as a miniature of the natural and social world, or in theories of bodily humors and signatures, as well as in different forms of divination, including astrology. Analogical systems conceive complex correspondences between the body and the diverse parts and aspects of the cosmos. Sometimes these are ordered in an all-inclusive classification system based on polar qualities such as hot and cold, wet and dry, used to group and correlate existing entities and phenomena. In these systems, well-being and causes of misfortune are thought to stem from beings and entities, exert influence on the destiny of humans, and simultaneously are influenced by the behavior of humans. So some typical features of analogical ontologies with regard to the self. One typical feature of them is that the attributes of interiority and physicality are fragmented into multiple components where mind and matter are not opposed to each other, but are intimately interlinked. Thus, it is often difficult to assign the components of a being exclusively to the physical or to the spiritual. Often we can find multiple components or centers of the self that constitute an organism, govern life, individuation, and psychic functions. Body parts are often thought to be infused with the life force or essence of the individual to which they belong. Organs often appear as seats of consciousness, thoughts, and feelings. Moreover, in analogical ontologies, the unity of the self is often unstable and seen in need of protection. One finds beliefs in multiple souls, some of which can leave the body temporarily or abandon it upon death. There's a great concern about losing essential elements of one's identity through the influence of harmful beings. There's also a need to maintain efficient channels of communication with the forces that are seen to influence human destiny. The human being is seen as located in a dense web of divine and cosmic forces. Great attention is placed on prohibitions and prescriptions to regulate individuals, collectives, and their interrelations with other beings. And this is usually done by specialists, such as in divination or rituals. Other typical traits are forms for managing complex social worlds, for example, through hierarchies as social classes, castes, and functions. So now coming to Mesopotamia, I would like to illustrate some of these features through the lens of ancient Mesopotamian sources. Mesopotamian written traditions and other sources provide clues of native understanding about what it meant to be a human being, what constitutes an individual, and how a person should live within society. Sources from this culture or from these cultures also provide ample documentation expressing a sense of self and individuality. As do other analogical ontologies, the Mesopotamians ordered existing beings into classes of entities placed in a hierarchy. Such a view can be gleaned, for example, from lexical lists used in scribal education, such as lists of professions, but also from artistic objects, such as the so-called Uruk cult vase, as shown here, dating to the end of the 4th millennium, the so-called Uruk period, the era of the invention of cuneiform writing. This vase depicts core representatives of beings in the scale of existence. forming participants in a cosmic and social order. Several rows of friezes depict from bottom to top a stream of water as the fundamental life-giving substance, plant and animal life, represented by the main agricultural products of human labor, grain and domesticated animals, who together with human offering bearers march in a huge procession headed on the uppermost level by the Ain, the city ruler, carrying a large piece of cloth. The procession of offering bringers is received by the priestess of Inanna, the main goddess of Uruk, in her temple, represented by divine statues and cult symbols. Although this image presents a hierarchy of life forms, deities, humans, animals, plants, all these entities are also bearers or providers of life or life force, which is in the Sumerian language, one of the main languages of Mesopotamia, called Z, breath, life substance. The Mesopotamian cosmos was headed by the divine pantheon. The gods were seen as the creators of the cosmos and its inhabitants, as well as the inventors of social institutions and aspects of civilized life and culture. The gods also represented cosmic forces and entities in the natural world, such as heavenly bodies, wind, light, fire, and so on. Human beings were created to serve the gods, that is, to provide for them and venerate them, thereby relieving them from the toil of labor. Although they shared the component of life force associated with the breath, humans were also differentiated from animals. Humans differed from animals, especially wild animals, through their civilized way of life, which consisted especially in the care for one's body, grooming, anointing, wearing woven garments, eating prepared food, drinking fermented beverages, and performing a social role for the well-being of the collective or group, as is nicely illustrated by this passage from the famous Gilgamesh epic here in the Old Babylonian version from the beginning of the 2nd millennium BCE. The passage describes the taming or civilizing process of the wild man Enkidu, who lived in the steppe with the animals, but was turned into a human being through initiation into these cultural practices. According to Mesopotamian standards, a civilized human being was also sedentary, lived in a city or at least in a house, offered a burial to the members of his or her group, which was linked to providing regular offerings for one's deceased ancestors and family members. Mesopotamian differentiated humans from non-human beings in several ways. Both humans and animals possessed breath of life and were mortal. But humans also had to live with the knowledge that they had to die eventually. Death had been decreed for humans by the gods as part of their destiny, called in Sumerian language Namtar, and in the Akkadian language, a Semitic language, and the second main language of Mesopotamia, Shimtu. The concept of destiny in Mesopotamian sources encompasses a collective or cosmic and an individual level. While the destiny of humankind consisted in their mortality, in cultural norms and customs of life, the destiny of the individual encompassed physical, psychic, and social aspects, such as physical appearance, character traits, temperament, one's allotted social position and gender roles, good and bad luck in one's life, as well as one's allotted day of death. While one's personal destiny was usually regarded as predetermined, a person's behavior, good or bad, could lead to changes and modifications in one's fate brought about by the gods in positive or negative ways. The Mesopotamian cosmos was also filled with a whole or as wind-like spirits inhabiting places such as mountains, the steppe, rivers, or swamps. Demons, spirits, and monsters could be harmful or beneficial, either opposing and excluded, or integrated and serving the divine cosmic order. The evil demons were excluded from the temple cults and offerings reserved for the gods and dwelt in the wilderness. And they were harmful, anti-social forces preying on humans, bringing sickness and death. Other more positive spirits and monsters served the gods and represented life-giving forces. Gods and demons shared awe-inspiring qualities and powers beyond those of humans, and they were largely depicted as immortal. There are, however, aspects in the human being which are of a divine origin. This is expressed in the Atram-Krasis myth, which contains an account of how the gods created human beings. In this myth, the first human being is created from the flesh and blood of a slain god, whose main characteristic was temo, intelligence, mind, reason, which represents the capacity of understanding, of decision-making and acting effectively in accordance with common sense and social norms, but which also harbored a more negative and dangerous potential to question, protest, or rebel against the status quo. A second component that human beings inherited from the slain god is the etemo, the ghost or spirit of the dead. The spirit is said to dwell in the bodily matrix of the living person, and the heartbeat was seen as the sign of its presence. When a person died, this spirit harboring the deceased person's identity was liberated from the body in the form of a wind that had to be blown away, that is sent down to the netherworld, the world of the dead. But the spirit retained a link to the dead body and the bones resting in the grave. The spirits of the dead needed to be fed and remembered by their living descendants, and as ancestors continued to influence the world of the living. Spirits of the dead who were not buried or cared for and therefore unhappy were believed to roam and haunt the living. They could take possession of human beings and inflict illness and suffering on them in similar ways as evil demons. The human being in Mesopotamia can thus be described as a composite being, constituted by multiple parts, some of which have a divine origin. A second trait of Mesopotamian views of the person is that physicality and interiority are intimately linked. It is a typical trait of Mesopotamian languages, and here are some examples of Akkadian terms, are used to refer to the self or to capacities such as thinking, feeling, reflection. Emotions are frequently expressed as embodied experiences. The body was thus the essential person and linked with one's unique self, the Brahmano. The self was embodied, but simultaneously encompassed aspects such of consciousness and interiority. The self could feel, think, reflect, could have intentions, make decisions for oneself, and stir the person to act. But this self could also become threatened by sickness caused by divine punishment or by the harmful influence or presence of a demon spirit or witchcraft, taking possession of or destroying a person's self. Such experiences are often described in medical texts, but also in literary texts, as you see here, one example of in healing incantations and prayers, here one example of, which often speak of losing oneself and mind, temo, expressed as not knowing oneself or forgetting oneself. Another recurring tenor in Mesopotamian literature is the warning that trusting solely in oneself rather than in the gods, that means individual independence and autonomy, would lead to the person's fall and doom. Rather, dependence on or interdependence with others was emphasized. Another Akkadian term expressing a notion of individuality is simtu, which means literally that which is proper or characteristic to an individual, his or her characteristic appearance, feature, way of being. This term brings us to extracorporeal components or extensions of the self and modes of representing the person and his or her identity. Thus, objects such as statues could serve as surrogate bodies and substitutes replacing the represented being. This way of extending the self in substitute bodies infused with a person's identity is amply attested, for example, in votive statues commissioned by rulers or by members of the elite and set up in temples, in the various types of royal representations, but it is also encountered in the use of personal seals and adornments. In many cases, such representations are additionally infused with the person's identity by being inscribed with his or her name and titles, or even longer inscriptions, as is typical in votives, royal imagery, and on seals, the latter of which could also be worn on the body and be imprinted on legal documents and other objects. An example of such ego documents is seen also in the curse formulae of royal inscriptions inscribed on stelae or on palace reliefs, which curse anyone who would destroy the images and depictions bearing the king's name. Such representations were seen as a means to preserve one's memory beyond one's death, thereby establishing a kind of immortality and durability of one's own self in the world of the living. Another context for the use of substitute bodies is encountered in rituals, for example, in healing and anti-witchcraft rituals, in which the patient or the witch threatening him or her is represented by figurines whose manipulation is thought to have a direct impact on the represented person. Finally, I would like to draw attention to one last significant aspect of Mesopotamian views of the human being, in which the human and the divine are again intertwined. As Annette Skoll has shown, a human person and his or her body was conceived as a house with different divine inhabitants, acting as hypostases, one could say, of an individual's self and personality. Thus, ideal properties and aspects of the person, beauty, attractiveness, dignity, grace, life energy and good luck, intelligence and success in life, were seen as manifestations of these divine beings that were believed to be present or close to their host, acting as protective powers that enabled their carrier to be well and thrive in every possible way. This means also socially. These personal deities have been described as externalized souls that are mobile and separable from their host. That is, they can leave the individual, resulting in a loss of good luck, health, and other positive properties. A human being was believed to have a personal god and goddess, Ilu and Ishtaru, a role which could be assumed by deities of the pantheon. In particular, the personal god was associated with a person's temo, his or her mental faculties. In addition to this pair of deities, an individual was believed to be accompanied by another pair of protective deities, designated as Shedu and Lamassu, who are often represented on seals and act as the individual's protectors and intermediaries to higher authorities. Moreover, there were other components linked to the body and self, but having the capacity to detach themselves from the person, such as Bashtu, dignity, attractiveness, personified and represented in the figure of a naked female shown en face, as here on this seal on the right-hand side. So I hope this brief overview has provided an impression of how much ancient Mesopotamian notions of the self differed from our own views. The case of Mesopotamia as an example of an analogical ontology has shown, I hope, the range of cross-cultural variations but also common principles on which concepts of the self are based. So I would like to thank you